In the early decades of the Soviet Union, religious communities that refused to conform to state ideology were often treated as hostile elements. Among them were the Old Believers, a group that had separated from the Russian Orthodox Church centuries earlier and preserved strict religious traditions, rituals, and a way of life that rejected modern reforms. By the 1930s, the Soviet state viewed such communities with suspicion. Religious practice was discouraged, collectivization disrupted traditional rural life, and surveillance became a constant reality in many regions. For families like the Lykovs, this pressure was not abstract. It was personal, immediate, and increasingly dangerous. Karp Lykov was a member of the Old Believer community living in southern Siberia. His faith rejected state authority over spiritual life, and his family avoided collective farms and official institutions whenever possible. Over time, this refusal drew attention. Encounters with local officials became more frequent. Neighbors disappeared. Arrests were no longer rumors. They were events witnessed directly. According to later accounts, the turning point came when members of the family witnessed violence directed at fellow believers. This was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader campaign that targeted those unwilling to abandon religious practices. For Karp Lykov, remaining in place meant exposure, interrogation, and eventually forced compliance or worse. The decision to leave was not driven by a belief that life in isolation would be easier. It was driven by the belief that staying would be impossible. In the late 1930s, Karp Lykov gathered his wife Akulina and their children and began moving east, away from settlements, roads, and any trace of Soviet administration. They traveled on foot, carrying only what they could manage: basic tools, seeds, religious books, and clothing. Their destination was not a specific location, but a direction, deeper into the Siberian taiga. With each passing week, the signs of civilization disappeared. Paths became animal trails, trails became forest, forest gave way to mountains. Eventually, they reached the remote slopes of the Sayan Mountains, an area so inaccessible that even experienced hunters avoided it. At that point, the family made a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They stopped moving. There was no intention to return, no plan for contact, no expectation of rescue. The outside world, with its laws, wars, and political campaigns, was deliberately left behind. From that moment on, the Lykov family ceased to exist in any official record. They were no longer citizens, no longer subjects of the state, and no longer part of history as it unfolded beyond the forest. They had not escaped temporarily. They had left permanently. Once the Lykov family settled in the remote Sayan Mountains, survival became their primary and constant concern. The area they chose was not merely distant, it was practically unreachable. Dense forest, steep terrain, extreme winters, and the absence of arable land made permanent settlement nearly impossible by ordinary standards. There were no villages nearby, no roads, no seasonal travelers. The family was completely alone. The first years were spent building a shelter using only hand tools they had carried with them. The cabin was small, made of rough logs, partially dug into the slope to retain heat. There were no windows in the modern sense, only narrow openings covered with bark and cloth. Smoke escaped through gaps in the roof. Food production was limited and uncertain. The growing season in the mountains was short, often interrupted by early frosts. The family planted potatoes, rye, hemp, and a few vegetables whenever conditions allowed. Harvests were unpredictable and failures were common. When crops failed, they relied on foraging, berries, pine nuts, wild roots, and whatever small animals could be trapped. Hunting large game was rare. Ammunition had long since been exhausted, and metal tools wore down beyond repair. Most of their equipment was handmade or endlessly reused. Clothing was patched repeatedly. Shoes were constructed from bark and scraps of fabric. Nothing was discarded unless it could no longer serve any function. Fire was essential. Keeping it alive through Siberian winters required constant attention. Wood had to be cut daily, even during illness or exhaustion. Without fire, survival would have been measured in hours. Time, as measured by the outside world, lost its meaning. There were no calendars, clocks, or reference points beyond seasonal changes. Days were structured around work, prayer, and survival tasks. Religious practice remained central to daily life. The Old Believer traditions were strictly preserved, passed verbally from parents to children. Education occurred entirely within the family. Children learned to read using religious texts. Writing was limited, as paper was scarce and ink nearly impossible to produce. Knowledge of the outside world froze at the moment the family disappeared into the forest. Political events, wars, technological advances, all of it continued without them. As the years passed, isolation deepened. Children grew into adults, having never seen another human being outside their family. They did not know the sound of engines, radios, or airplanes. The concept of modern society existed only as distant memory, described cautiously and infrequently by their father. Illness posed a constant threat. There was no medicine, no professional knowledge of treatment. Minor infections could become fatal. Injuries healed slowly, if at all. When sickness struck, it was endured, not treated. Despite these conditions, the family survived. Decades passed. The forest reclaimed any trace of their presence. Snow erased paths. Trees grew where gardens once struggled. From the outside, there was no sign that anyone lived there at all. By the time the Soviet Union entered the space age, launched satellites, and tested nuclear weapons, the Lykovs were still living as they had in the 1930s. Unaware that humanity had reached orbit, unaware that the world they fled had changed beyond recognition. Their isolation was now absolute. They were no longer hiding. They were forgotten. As the years passed, the Lykov family's separation from the outside world became more than physical. It became chronological. Without calendars, newspapers, or communication of any kind, time was measured only through natural cycles. Winters and summers replaced years. Crop failures and successful harvests marked the passage of life more clearly than dates. The family aged, but history did not exist as a continuous narrative. Their understanding of the world remained fixed at the moment they had left it. They had no knowledge of the Second World War, despite it being one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. They did not know that millions had died, that borders had shifted, or that the Soviet Union had emerged as a global superpower. The war passed without reaching them, both physically and conceptually. They did not know that Stalin had died. Leadership changes, political campaigns, and ideological shifts inside the Soviet state were completely unknown. The names of leaders stopped being updated. Portraits were never replaced. Slogans never changed because there was no one to change them. Technological progress unfolded silently beyond the forest. The family did not know about electricity becoming widespread, about television, about nuclear weapons, or about human beings traveling into space. The launch of Sputnik, which symbolized a new era for humanity, occurred without leaving any trace in their lives. For the Lykovs, the sky remained unchanged, a place of weather, seasons, and religious meaning, not technology. Knowledge inside the family was transmitted only through memory. Religious texts became the primary source of literacy and reference. Pages were preserved carefully, repaired when damaged, and read repeatedly. Over time, these texts began to serve not only as spiritual guides, but as historical anchors, reminders of a world that no longer existed around them. Language itself began to shift. Isolated from broader linguistic change, their speech preserved older forms of Russian that had disappeared elsewhere. New words never entered their vocabulary. Concepts that did not exist in the 1930s had no terms. Modern ideas could not be expressed because there was no framework to describe them. Death occurred without ceremony beyond family rituals. Several children were born in isolation and lived their entire lives without seeing another human being. Others died without medical assistance, buried in the forest near the dwelling. Each loss reduced the family further, narrowing the circle of shared memory. By the 1960s and 1970s, the outside world had become almost abstract. For the younger members of the family, the idea of society was not something remembered. It was something described secondhand, cautiously and incompletely. The forest, the mountains, and the cabin were not a refuge from the world. They were the world. Isolation was no longer a temporary condition or a conscious resistance. It had become normality. When helicopters began to appear occasionally over the Sian Mountains in the 1970s, they passed unnoticed or were interpreted through religious understanding rather than technological explanation. No one imagined that these machines would soon alter a life that had remained unchanged for 4 decades. The Lykov family had not waited for history to return. They had learned to live without it. In the summer of 1978, a geological survey team was conducting routine exploration in the remote regions of the Sian Mountains. The work involved aerial reconnaissance, mapping terrain that was largely inaccessible by foot. Such flights were common and rarely produced anything beyond geological data. During one of these flights, the crew noticed something unusual. From the air, they observed a small, cultivated area on a mountainside, a patch of land that showed clear signs of human activity. In a region considered uninhabited, this was unexpected. There were no registered settlements, no roads, and no known seasonal camps in that area. At first, the site was treated with caution. The team assumed the patch might belong to hunters or temporary workers who had failed to register their presence. However, further observation suggested long-term cultivation rather than a temporary stay. The soil appeared worked. Crops were growing in rows. This indicated not only presence, but permanence. The geologists decided to investigate. Reaching the site required a difficult journey on foot through dense forest and uneven terrain. When they approached the clearing, they encountered a small, crude dwelling constructed from logs and earth. Its condition suggested age. This was not a recent structure. The first contact was cautious on both sides. Members of the Lykov family emerged slowly, visibly alarmed by the appearance of strangers. For them, this was the first encounter with outsiders in more than 40 years. They had no frame of reference for modern clothing, equipment, or speech patterns used by the geologists. Communication was slow. The family spoke an archaic form of Russian, shaped by decades of isolation. The geologists, in turn, struggled to understand references to events and beliefs that no longer existed in the same form outside the forest. Initial conversations focused on basic facts: names, relationships, and how long the family had lived there. The length of their isolation became clear only gradually. As questions were asked and answers compared, the geologists realized that the family had no knowledge of major historical events. The absence of awareness was not selective, it was complete. Wars, political changes, technological developments, none had reached them. The discovery posed an immediate dilemma. The geologists were not equipped to handle such a situation. There were no established procedures for reintroducing people who had lived entirely outside society for decades. Any intervention carried risk. At the same time, leaving the family without assistance raised ethical concerns. Initial aid was minimal. The geologists offered small amounts of food and tools, careful not to overwhelm the family. Items were introduced gradually. Even basic materials, metal utensils, salt, fabric, were unfamiliar and sometimes frightening. The family examined each object cautiously, often refusing items that conflicted with religious beliefs. News of the discovery was reported to authorities. Specialists were informed, including doctors and anthropologists. The situation was treated as exceptional. Unlike forced relocations or state interventions of earlier decades, the approach here was measured, shaped by an awareness of how fragile the family's health and social structure had become. The forest, which had protected the Lykovs for decades, had finally been breached. Not by force, not by search, but by chance. The isolation that had defined their lives was over. The consequences of that contact, however, were only beginning to unfold. After the initial discovery, contact between the Lykov family and the outside world became more regular. Geologists returned periodically, bringing small supplies and attempting to assess the family's condition. Medical specialists were eventually consulted, though access to professional care remained limited due to the remoteness of the location. The introduction of external assistance was cautious. Food items unfamiliar to the family were offered in small quantities. Salt, which the Lykovs had lived without for decades, was introduced gradually. Metal tools replaced worn wooden and stone implements. Clothing made from modern fabrics was provided, though not always accepted. Despite careful pacing, the consequences of contact became apparent. Members of the family had no immunity to common illnesses. Decades of isolation meant that even minor infections posed serious risks. Exposure to bacteria and viruses that were harmless to the visitors proved dangerous to the Lykovs. Within a short period after regular contact began, several members of the family fell ill. Medical intervention was limited by both distance and timing. By the time symptoms were fully recognized, conditions had often progressed beyond effective treatment. The illnesses spread quickly within the small, closely connected group. Over the course of the early 1980s, most of the family died. The deaths were not caused by starvation or violence, but by infections introduced unintentionally through contact with the modern world. For the geologists and specialists involved, this outcome highlighted a reality that had not been fully anticipated. Isolation had protected the family not only from political repression, but from biological exposure as well. The impact of these losses was severe. The family unit, which had functioned as a closed system for decades, was reduced rapidly. Knowledge, routines, and shared memory disappeared with each death. What had survived 40 years of isolation could not survive a brief period of exposure. Authorities considered relocation. There were discussions about moving the remaining family members closer to medical facilities or integrating them into nearby settlements. These options were examined carefully, but ultimately rejected by the surviving members. For them, the forest was not a place of exile. It was home. The environment that had nearly destroyed them had also sustained them for most of their lives. Leaving it meant entering a world that felt foreign, unpredictable, and spiritually incompatible. By the mid-1980s, only one member of the family remained. The long-term consequences of contact were now irreversible. What had begun as an accidental discovery had resulted in the collapse of a way of life that had endured for more than 4 decades. The final chapter of the Lykov family story would not be defined by isolation alone, but by what remained after it ended. After the deaths of her family members, Agafia Lykova remained alone in the Sion Mountains. She chose not to leave. Despite repeated offers of relocation, medical assistance, and permanent housing, Agafia refused integration into modern society. Her decision was not impulsive. It reflected a lifetime shaped entirely by isolation, religious belief, and self-sufficiency. Limited contact with the outside world continued. Occasionally, supplies were delivered by helicopter. Visitors included scientists, journalists, and local officials. These visits were infrequent and controlled. Agafia accepted certain forms of help, food, tools, medical examinations, while maintaining strict boundaries regarding her way of life. Her living conditions remained extremely basic. She continued to rely on subsistence farming, foraging, and manual labor. Winters remained severe. Access to medicine was minimal. Injuries and illness were treated primarily through traditional methods and prayer. Over time, Agafia became a symbol rather than a participant. Media attention increased sporadically, particularly during anniversaries of the discovery. Stories emphasized endurance, faith, and survival. However, these narratives often simplified a reality that was far more complex and physically demanding. From Agafia's perspective, her choice was consistent. The world she had been born into had disappeared before she ever knew it. The forest was not a place she had escaped to. It was the only environment in which her life made sense. The skills required to survive there were learned over decades and could not be transferred easily to modern society. As years passed, her isolation became partial rather than absolute. She was aware of the existence of the modern world, but remained separate from it. Contact occurred on her terms. The forest remained her primary reference point, her shelter, and her identity. Today, Agafia Lykova remains one of the last known individuals in Russia living in near-complete isolation by choice. Her life does not fit neatly into categories of heroism or tragedy. It represents a sustained refusal to abandon a way of life that the modern world no longer recognizes. The story of the Lykov family is not about disappearance. It is about persistence, and about what remains when history moves on without you.